Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. And as I previously mentioned on the show, one of the ways that we like to do that is by talking about Calvinistic Baptists throughout the history of the church. And we have the privilege to do that today by talking about one Calvinistic Baptist that perhaps you are not that familiar with. And we hope that maybe you will become more familiar with this man by the time this conversation is over, and that is John Ryland. And to have that conversation, we have the privilege of talking with Garrett Walden in this episode. So welcome to the podcast, Garrett.
Man, I'm grateful to be here, Austin.
Yeah, thank you for coming on, and welcome back, actually. We previously had you on a few months ago with a number of brothers from the London Lyceum to discuss the John Gill project that you guys are working on. But for our listeners that didn't catch that episode, and for our listeners that may not know you, can you just take a moment to introduce yourself or reintroduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, certainly. So my name is Garrett Walden. I'm married to my wife, Kat. Coming up on 9 years. And so it's been a wonderful time. We have 4 children. Henry is 7, Eleanor is 5, Phoebe is 3, and Louise is about 1.5 years. So they keep us pretty busy, and grateful for them. I'm one of the pastors at Grace Heritage Church here in Auburn, Alabama. And so I've been at the church about 6 years or so, and I've been a pastor for about 3.5 years at the church. And so grateful to be part of the ministry there, and just a sweet fellowship and congregation. You mentioned just in the intro about coming from a confessional Baptist perspective. Our church affirms the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And so it's great to be in like-minded company. So that's just a little bit about that. So I also am one of the editors for the London Lyceum, which is kind of an online center for analytic Baptist and confessional theology. And so I just kind of do a lot of editing of mostly written material there, and I really enjoy that. It's just a wonderful fellowship of like-minded men and women, and so it's just been a wonderful time.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think you recently graduated from Southern with a THM. So although you didn't mention that, I just wanted to mention my congratulations to you, brother. And I'm not exactly sure. I think I'm right in guessing that part of your THM degree was research on the person that we're going to be speaking about in this conversation. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, that's right. So, to make a long story short, I entered the PhD program at Southern Seminary to study with Dr. Michael Haken in early Baptist history and theology. And so just here recently, I decided to stop that PhD pursuit for just a number of different reasons. And I took the THM. I was pretty much right at the point where I had earned enough credits to receive the THM. And I pulled together some essays and had a thesis that was related to John Ryland. And so Lord willing, that thesis might see publication one day soon. And so I've got a handful of essays related to some research with Ryland. And so really for the past several years, I've committed myself to Baptist history and theology and John Ryland in particular.
Yeah, great. And so our next question is why? Why would you spend all of this time studying someone as obscure, at least to popular level church history, people who are interested in church history? Why would you spend so much time in someone like John Ryland? What led you to start studying about him?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I get asked somewhat often. And so the short answer is I had a phone conversation with Dr. Haken, and I just asked him, what are some things that need someone just to take up and take some ownership of and study and research and write about? What are the gaps in the literature? And he said, one way I could approach that pursuit is to take one figure from Baptist history, someone who's relatively little known, and just kind of take him as my guy and just pursue everything I can to learn more about him, and maybe find some ways to publish about him. And so he just listed off about a dozen names just off the top of his head in this phone call. And I wasn't prepared for that. And so I'm like trying to like find ways to remember some of the things that he said. And by the time the phone call was over, after we had talked for a little while, the only name that I could remember was John Collett Ryland. And so I just Googled his name. I don't even know if I spelled it correctly, but I Googled his name and just started digging around what I could find on the internet. And I stumbled across one document that was written by John Collett Ryland, and I just started reading it, and it was just incredible. I was like, wow, I can't believe that there's no significant work done on this person. I mean, this is just amazing material that I found. And I found a PDF scan of a work that I'll come back to later, but it's this 1782 book that he wrote on the divinity of Christ. And it's a 450-page book that had been scanned in by, like, I don't know, the British Library or something like that. And it's free online on Google Books. And so I just downloaded the PDF and printed it off and just started reading it. And it's just amazing Orthodox classical Christology. And he is citing people that I love. And so he's, using a lot of stuff from John Owen and from John Gill and from some other kind of great reformers and Puritans. And so he's just an amazing figure. And so like that work is, a 450-page book on classical Christology from a particular Baptist. I was like, wow, this is just a treasure trove. So, I'm reading along in that book. I just stumbled across it, and he's referencing other works that he had published. So I start just trying to figure out how I can find them. And next thing you know, long story short, I created an exhaustive bibliography of the works of John Ryland, basically that way of like looking through his notes and looking at other databases. And I've compiled a bibliography of a little over 120 unique titles that were written by John Collett Ryland. And so it really is like a honey hole of Baptist literature by this man. So that's kind of how I kind of got into it, is just really tracking down all the stuff that he wrote and reading it along the way.
Yeah, that's incredible that you've been able to compile a bibliography of his sources. And I'm sure that has been really enjoyable for you as you've done your part in trying to recover some Baptist history. And in your study of John Collett Ryland, what have you learned about his life? Would you be willing to share with us a biographical sketch of this person? I'm assuming that even those of our listeners that are interested in church history or even particular Baptist history might know little about this man of God. So can you tell us about him?
Yeah, certainly. So the reason I keep saying, and Austin keeps saying, John Collett Ryland is because he has a son by the same name, John Ryland Jr. And it's important to distinguish the two. They often get mixed up in the history. So John Ryland Jr. was the close friend of Andrew Fuller and William Carey and John Sutcliffe and Samuel Pierce and all of those men that formed the Baptist Missionary Society in 1792. Of course, John Ryland Jr. goes on to become the president of the Bristol Baptist Academy. And so John Ryland Jr. is a massive figure in his own right in Baptist history. But his father, John Collett Ryland, is slightly lesser known because and there's some reasons for that I'll get into. But the long story short of John Collett Ryland is that he was born in 1723. And he died in 1792. So he's a true 18th century man. He's kind of born in the middle of, not in a major city or anything like that. He's kind of lives a rambunctious lifestyle as a child and a young man. He eventually makes his way to Burton on the Water, kind of a lesser known town or village in the area, and begins attending the church pastored by Benjamin Bedham. And Benjamin Bedham was an amazing hymn writer and pastor and preacher in the region. And there was a revival that broke out in 1741. And John Collett Ryland, along with about 40 other people, were converted in this revival. And so early 1740s, he becomes a Christian. And pretty much early on, Benjamin Beddome identified just the gifts of teaching and intellect in young Ryland, and so sent him to Bristol Academy to study, which was essentially like a seminary. It was one of the few places where Baptists could receive a theological education in that time because of some political restrictions. And so he goes to the Bristol Academy in the mid 1740s, 1744 to 1746 or so, and studies under Bernard Foskett and Hugh Evans. And so he has a pretty terrible time there. He did not fare well in seminary. He had such a voracious appetite for literature. He's reading a ton. He is just saturated in the works of John Owen and a few others. But he's memorizing the Baptist Catechism. He's studying the Second London Confession and the works of John Gill. But he goes through kind of a spiritual depression where he begins to second guess a lot of things that he was raised to believe. So he questions the existence of God. He questions the divinity of Christ, the reliability of the scriptures. He questions the reality of his own soul and if there's an afterlife. And so he just is really wrestling with a lot of different questions, possibly stimulated by kind of the Enlightenment rationalism that's popular at this time. And so eventually he kind of breaks through some of that hesitancy and suspicion and doubt and finds assurance and is called out to preach at this town called Warwick. And so he becomes a regular preacher there, and after a while they call him to be the pastor there. So he's the pastor at Warwick from 1750 till about 1759. While he's there, he becomes a close friend of James Harvey, a person who's another kind of one of the great revival preachers and writers and theologians. He's a friend of Philip Doddridge and a few others. And shortly after that, kind of his most famous kind of stretch of ministry is in Northampton. He becomes the pastor of the Baptist Church in Northampton. He's there from 1759 to 1785. And that kind of becomes the center of Baptist activity in the English Midlands. And it's there that they form the Northamptonshire Baptist Association. And it's that association that eventually develops the Baptist Missionary Society. And so while he's at Northampton, he has great connections with John Newton and William Cooper over in Olney. He's again just a close friend of John Brine and John Gill, and has lots of just really interesting things that happen while he's there at Northampton. It's a really successful ministry. It's one of the larger Baptist churches in the area and even in the country. It eventually grows to a little over 200 people during Ryland's ministry, which is very large for a Baptist church in that time. And let's see, I think while he was there, it says that the building had to be enlarged twice to accommodate the hearers that came to the church. And so I don't know that we would call it a revival that happens at Northampton, but a significantly successful ministry. And it's probably largely due to John Ryland's preaching. There are some people who have written about him in their memoirs who have said he's one of the most gifted preachers in the country and one of the most gifted preachers in Baptist history. There are people that say some kind of exaggerated things like that. They've likened him to Demosthenes and like a Baptist George Whitefield and that sort of thing. And there are really only, I think, 2 of his sermons that survive, at least that I know about. I'd love to find some more. But I think I only know about 2 of his sermons that survive. And when you read them, I believe it 100%. Just the way that he was able to write and communicate is really just extraordinary. But, he was an extemporaneous preacher. He would study all week and then just kind of preach just as the Spirit led in the moment. And so not a lot of his sermons were written down. So just on that note, he was a good friend of George Whitefield. There's a letter that we have that Whitefield wrote back to Ryland I wished we had more of Ryland's letters out to other people, but so we know he's a friend of Whitefield, a critic of John Wesley, and there's just lots of other interesting things about him. But just to kind of wind it down, in 1785 he leaves his pastorate at Northampton. He leaves it in the charge of his son. His son, John Ryland Jr., becomes a co-pastor with him there in 1781. So they're pastors together until for about 4 years till 1785, and then Ryland kind of retires to a town called Enfield, which is kind of near London, and he's there for the rest of his life till 1792. I say kind of retires because there was a question about why exactly he left Northampton, and it's pretty much understood at this point that there were some financial indiscretions in Ryland's life, largely to do with printing too many books. we might have similar problems of buying too many books and get ourselves in trouble. But he basically bought books and published books and produced books and put himself in financial hardship, which is kind of a scandalous thing for a minister to do, to find himself in financial hardship for any reason, really. But others have said, he was also just too generous when people asked for money. Like he pretty much never said no. And people knew that about him and knew that he was kind of gullible to a kind of a sad story and kind of took advantage of him. So he eventually kind of finds himself in financial trouble. And John Ryland Jr. has a long series of letters with John Newton about that. And so John Ryland Jr. and some friends essentially bail John Ryland Sr. out of his financial trouble. But it was enough that he needed to remove himself from ministry for a time to get his finances in order. So just maybe one last thing, just to give you a picture about him. He was a schoolmaster. That was kind of his main thing other than preaching. He was a bivocational pastor. So when he was at Warwick and when he was at Northampton and after he moved to Enfield, he managed really successful boarding schools that people would send their children from all over. So it was a boys' school. They would come and live at the school. And he was just a really successful teacher and tutor of students. So that's kind of a big picture sketch of his life. You're welcome to ask any other kind of questions, but I'm sure I'll fill in some more gaps as we go.
Yeah, thank you for that biographical sketch. That was really helpful, especially the part at the end. I didn't know about him bringing himself to some financial trouble. Maybe there will be some application that we can make at the end related to some of the things that you talked about in his life. But thank you for that sketch. It was really helpful. The only thing that I ever knew of this man, John Collett Ryland, is that he's the one that is often portrayed as engaging with William Carey, the well-known story that involves William Carey, and he's presented as a hyper-Calvinist for supposedly rebuking William Carey for being eager to evangelize the nations. I'm sure you have a lot of feedback to give in relation to this. So from your study of John Collett Ryland, can you recount this story either as it is often told or as it should be told in your estimation, and then tell our audience your thoughts about John Collett Ryland's theological convictions on hyper-Calvinism or the free offer of the gospel, or wherever you want to take that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So I didn't mention in the biographical sketch because I knew we would get to this question. So John Collett Ryland, if anyone ever knows his name, it's really only for this, which of course I think is a shame because there's just so much more to him than that. But the story with him and William Carey, the main part that everybody wants to talk about is this ministers' meeting that happens on September 30th, 1785. But the story of Ryland and Carey actually goes prior to that. William Carey, when he's converted years prior, he goes to John Ryland Sr. and asks to be baptized. And so William Carey was a close friend of John Ryland Jr. And he goes to John Ryland Sr. and asks to be baptized. And Ryland Sr. says, wonderful, this is amazing. And John Ryland Jr. actually is the one that baptizes them right at the foot of the the church property there in Northampton. And so it's, they have a connection. This isn't just like some random guy that shows up with a crazy idea. So the way the story goes is the Northamptonshire Baptist Association. They meet usually in late May, early June every year for the association meeting. But then they have other ministers' meetings outside of that time, where just the pastors would get together just for mutual encouragement. And so it's at one of these meetings, September 30th, 1785. John Collett Ryland is kind of the leading pastor of the group, I guess, mainly probably because he's one of the oldest. And so he looks at these two younger men there and asks them to propose a topic for discussion for the ministers to talk about. One of the guys was a guy named John Webster Morris, who plays into the story. He says, hey, why don't we talk about basically did Christ die for all people without exception? Well, he's kind of wanting to get into like the extent of the atonement and some other details of the doctrines of grace. And John Ryland Sr. doesn't want to talk about that. So he says, just go home and read John Gill and John Bryan. Let's don't waste our time on that. They've already settled the question. And so then William Carey's the other guy, and William Carey says, well, hey, what about that passage at the end of Matthew where, Jesus tells the disciples to make disciples of all the nations? Does that apply just to the apostles, or does that imperative extend to the church through all the ages? And the way the story goes is that John Ryland gets, really flustered and frustrated by that question. And he says, sit down, young man. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he'll do it without your help or mine. And of course, William Carey's embarrassed in front of all of his peers. And so the way the story often gets told is John Ryland is this kind of gruff, cranky, hyper-Calvinist, and just has no compassion or heart for the nations, because hyper-Calvinism, there's no point in doing all that. And so that's kind of the story. And it's really unfortunate that that's really what Ryland is known for, because I think it's more complex than that. So I really do believe that one of the reasons that John Ryland is not more known than he is because people hear that one story and they think to themselves, wow, what a terrible, grouchy person. There's no way I don't want to know anything more about that man. That's a pretty awful thing. So one of the big questions when I started getting into Ryland is I was already, through reading that big book on the divinity of Christ. And so I was like, wait a minute, this is the same guy? There's just no way this is the same guy. And so I start looking into the history of that little encounter, and it's really quite interesting. There's several different narratives of what exactly happened, and none of them agree with one another. So John Webster Morris, the other guy that was there, he has his own account of that narrative in the little biography that he did on Andrew Fuller. There's a footnote in this biography of Fuller that John Webster Morris tells this event, and he adds a bunch of stuff in there where he brings up, do you know all these foreign languages? And then John Webster Morris also inserts some things about eschatology, that there's got to be a second Pentecost and essentially a second outpouring of the miraculous spiritual gifts. And some interpreters have a very legitimate case to make that because of Ryland's particular kind of premillennial eschatology, that the evangelism of the nations would have been premature during their time. They were waiting for other eschatological events to unfold before it would be the signal for the church to evangelize the nations. So there are people that would make a case that the reason Ryland said what he said to William Carey is for eschatology. Others, he was just cranky. Others, he was a hyper-Calvinist. And so what's interesting is John Webster Morris's biography of Fuller is not the most flattering portrayal of Fuller. And John Ryland Jr. was particularly asked by Fuller to do his authorized biography. So when John Ryland Jr., the next year, publishes, or really it was the same year, but later that year, publishes his biography of Fuller, he critiques in his own footnote John Webster Morris's account of that event of his father. And so John Ryland Jr. says, basically, in summary, paraphrase here, I can't believe John Webster Morris said that about my father at that meeting. There's just no way that ever happened. My father wasn't even at that meeting. There's no way that his eschatology would ever lead him to that conclusion. And I don't think he even said that to William Carey. And so now we're just, as a historian, you're like, well, wait a minute. Well, what even happened? John Ryland Jr. said, I think John Webster Morris is just misremembering all this. Well, years later, like a decade later, John Webster Morris puts out another edition of his biography of Fuller, and he responds to John Ryland Jr. and says, I'm right. I'm not misremembering. Actually, you're misremembering. And so there's kind of this weird little back and forth where they disagree about what happens. But John Webster Morris does concede one point. He says, if Ryland said this to Carey, perhaps he was his word was ironical. And in other words, what he's saying is maybe Ryland Sr. was joking or was being facetious in some way, and he wasn't being sincere, but just kind of, I don't know, being funny, and it just didn't land. It was a joke that didn't land. And that's kind of my take on this thing. I think John Ryland Sr. did say something harsh and rebuking to William Carey. I think there's just no way around that, because of some other corroborating evidence. For instance, William Carey mentions it to his nephew Eustace Carey. But so I think there was something said, but I don't think it was intended as an evidence of hyper-Calvinism, because I don't think Ryland was a hyper-Calvinist. I'll come back to that. And I don't think it is really having to do with eschatology, because John Ryland Jr. explicitly says it was not about eschatology. And they were co-pastors of the church at the time. And I think John Ryland Jr. would know. So I think it's probably just him trying to be funny, and it just didn't go. And I think that fits with other things that we know about John Ryland Sr. is if you look at anything that anyone ever says about John Ryland Sr., anyone who knew him, there's one common word that they all use to describe him, and it's the word eccentric. He was a bizarre man. And, I don't know what all they might have meant by that, but there are some really interesting narratives and stories about Ryland Sr. There's one that I just love to tell all the time, which is when he first meets a guy named William J. William J. was this great preacher in the area. He's a young man. He goes to Surrey Chapel in London. At this point, John Ryland Sr. is an old man in the infield. And Ryland Sr. just bursts into the door. He recognizes William J. from somewhere, and he grabs him by the back of the neck, and he says, "Young man, if you let the people of Surrey Chapel make you proud, I will smite you to the ground." And so he kind of has this temper and this kind of really exaggerated and hyperbolic personality. There's another great story of him preaching at this church, and the congregational singing was so bad, he stopped the service, and he says, "If you guys don't improve your congregational singing, I will not be surprised if an angel comes out of heaven and wrings your necks off." And so he kind of said things like that. Another instance with William J., there was a person who came in to the room where they were meeting and was telling them about some just horrific things that happened on a slave ship, things that I wouldn't want to even share on a podcast, but just horrific things. And William J. says that he watched this kind of like inner just writhing in John Ryland, that he got up and started pacing the room and was praying out loud, "God help me, God help me." Basically, I think he knew that he was about to explode in rage at hearing about what was happening in the slave trade. And he was trying to constrain himself and control himself, but eventually just burst out. And William J. was nice enough not to record it, but just says, just in the most awful imprecations that I dare not repeat, something like that. And so I think he had kind of an explosive personality. He's very, very exaggerated. and eccentric is the right word. Just one more story on that note. Robert Hall Sr. was a peer of John Ryland Sr. And at one point, Robert Hall Sr. put his son, Robert Hall Jr., into John Ryland Sr.'s academy at the school. And at this point, Robert Hall Jr. would have been just a small boy. And his father and John Ryland Sr. were close friends, and they were talking about the American colonies. And there was kind of this, the American Revolution was just starting to unfold, and John Ryland Sr. is speaking with Robert Hall, and young Robert Hall Jr. sitting right there. He says, "If I were General Washington, I would." He's like, "I would just let him have it." Let me find his exact words here. Well, it's escaping me right now. I'll just summarize the story. He says, "If I were General Washington, I would get all of my troops together, and we would all take out our swords, and we would cut our arms and pool our blood into one big basin. We'd dip our swords in there, and we would take a vow that we would not sheathe our swords again until the last British soldier is off of this land. And if any man should turn traitor, I would consider it a pleasure, actually a luxury, to plunge my sword into that man's heart." And and so Robert Hall Jr. was sitting there, just a young boy, and he was just terrified that his father was about to leave him with this man. And Robert Hall Jr. in his little memoir says, "I really thought he was going to kill me." And so Robert Hall, I think, was onto something there. The long story short is, I think John Ryland really was eccentric and said some things that don't really fit with his larger theology and his theological commitments. And I think those who were his friends kind of knew that about him and knew how to take him with a grain of salt at times. And I think the Carey interaction is kind of like that. So just to speak to the hyper-Calvinism question, I guess whether or not you say Ryland was a hyper-Calvinist depends on how you define hyper-Calvinism. I think there are two main tenets of hyper-Calvinism. The first is a denial of the free offer of the gospel. In other words, we do not use the language of offer to say that the gospel is offered to sinners. The reason why a hyper-Calvinist wouldn't want to say that, or why someone wouldn't want to say that, is because it makes the atonement of Christ sound potential. It takes away the definiteness of the atonement. And so a lot of Calvinists at this time, largely, honestly, influenced by John Gill and John Bryan and some others, they would not use the language of offer. The other tenet of hyper-Calvinism is a denial of duty faith. It's basically saying that people, or the unregenerate, do not have a duty or obligation to have faith in Christ, because they can't. If they're reprobate, they literally can't. Their inability means that they have no responsibility for faith. They're condemned on other counts, but not for not having faith in Christ. So I would say if the duty faith question and the free offer question, if those are the two tenets of hyper-Calvinism, Ryland is kind of a mixed bag. He does deny the language of offer, but he uses a lot of synonyms for offer. And so it makes it kind of complicated. So he's totally fine using language of inviting and pleading and persuading and a bunch of other terms that are really, really close to the language of offer. But he does say that he would not use the word offer. So I think that's more of a semantic thing than it is a theological commitment. And on the nature of faith, I haven't read anywhere where he denies the duty of faith. He affirms a bunch of other obligations that even the non-elect have to God in terms of right worship and love and obedience and a bunch of other things. And so I think it's really hard to make a case that Ryland was a hyper-Calvinist on those two counts. The offer one, I think, does stand. And so I would say that he is a moderately high Calvinist. So he's not exactly on the same wavelength as someone like Fuller or even his son John Ryland Jr. or William Carey. He's not exactly on the same wavelength, but he's really, really close, and he's not as far off of that as some others are. There are some other doctrines that kind of attend to hyper-Calvinism. For instance, the doctrine of eternal justification, um, an outright resistance to evangelism and missions, being critical of the revivals that took place. So, like, John Ryland was a village preacher. He was kind of a revivalist in his own right. He was a close friend of George Whitefield. He loved Jonathan Edwards. And so there's a lot of things about Ryland that just do not fit the mold of hyper-Calvinism at all. And so I've got some things here that I could read to you. There's one place where he specifically talks about the high Calvinists neglecting to speak to the unconverted, and he says that that's so wrong. I'll just read it here. He says, avoid two extremes. This is Ryland. He says, some high Calvinists neglect the unconverted, but Paul left no case untouched. He spoke properly and suitably to Felix as well as to Timothy. Some neglect to preach the law and tell their hearers to accept Christ. Others, he says, so some neglect to preach the law and tell their sinners to accept Christ. He says, oh, sinners, beware. If Christ says depart, it's all over. Depart into 1,000 Etnas, bursting up forever and ever. Your souls are now within an inch of damnation. I am clear of your blood. If you are condemned, I'll look you in the face at judgment and say, Lord, I told that man, I told those boys and girls on the 29th of August, 1790, I warned them, and they would not believe, and now they stand shivering at thy bar. And so he kind of preaches with this really strong pleading and exhortation and urging the responsibility of faith and repentance upon people. And here he's specifically setting himself in contrast to the high Calvinists. One more thing I'll just read, just because I love it so much, is this line from his book, Contemplations on the Beauties of Creation. Actually, just looking at my time, I probably better not read it. It's wonderful. He basically is just talking about his just compassion for souls. John Ryland loved evangelism, and he had so much compassion and pity in his heart for people who did not have the Bible and did not have gospel preaching. He wrote about it all the time. And so I would say there are some things that he says, like the no offer thing, that I think make him in that camp, but there's a bunch of other things that I think make him out of that camp. So I call him a moderately high Calvinist.
So it's a lot more complicated than just saying that he was the hyper Calvinist of this story that rebuked William Carey. Mm-hmm. So your assessment, moderately high Calvinist.
That's right. That's how I would categorize John Gill too, by the way. So that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, this is really helpful. And I know that there has been a lot of interest recently in John Gill. We recently had Jonathan Swan on, who I believe also is involved in the John Gill Project. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the London Lyceum, H&E, and the Andrew Fuller Center are working on the John Gill Project to bring back into publication some of John Gill's works. And you've mentioned a number of times John Brine, who is someone that I am becoming more interested in learning more about as I've talked with you in this time period. So maybe somebody will take him up as well, and we can learn more about these men in their time period and some of their theology. But transitioning us now, who were some of the biggest influences upon John Collett Ryland, and how do we know this?
Yeah, so certainly John Gill is probably the biggest theological influence. And I say that hesitantly because the more I read Ryland, he's referencing Gill all the time. He knew Gill personally. So Gill dies in 1771, and Ryland was in ministry from the mid 40s all the way to 1790. So like their times overlapped a lot. They knew each other. John Ryland preached in Gill's pulpit, like as a guest preacher. And back in this day when books were not always as easy to attain, John Ryland kept a full set of Gill's commentaries in the church, in like the main auditorium of the church for his church members to come and use. They could not take them out of the church, but they could come and read them in the seats if they wanted to. And so John Gill was just massively influential upon Ryland, as upon a bunch of other Baptists and others in the time. But the more I read Ryland, I will say a name that occurs possibly more frequently than Gill is Herman Whitsius. And he was a Continental Reformed theologian, and he wrote this wonderful 2-volume work. Well, we have it in 2 volumes. The Economy of the Covenants, recently redone by, I guess, Reformation Heritage, and just a wonderful compendium of theology. And so Ryland references Whitsius probably as much or more than he references Gill. And so he is kind of true to the Reformed tradition in his influences. One other that I think is just so influential upon Ryland is John Owen. And I mentioned this earlier, but I'm working on an essay right now on Owen, on Ryland's literary relationship to Owen. And so just to run down just a few things here, and you asked, how do we know this? We just look at who he cites. So he actually will put footnotes in his writing where he'll say see John Owen's discourse on the Holy Spirit, and he'll give the volume and the page number and all that too. So Ryland just kind of saturates his writing with references to other books. And so I think Ryland first encountered John Owen in 1744 on the mortification of sin and indwelling sin, and just kind of stays with Owen his entire life, really. He writes a kind of a recommendation in the latter years of his life for an abridged version of Owen's book on the Holy Spirit. There's a guy named George Berder who basically says, hey, the Holy Spirit book by Owen is really long and really complicated. I'm going to do an abridgment. And Ryland writes this long recommendation letter for it, almost we would call it a blurb. And so he does that. But probably his most significant connection with Owen is that I think it must be in 1790, Ryland translates for the first time ever Owen's dissertation on divine justice from Latin into English and reproduces it. So prior to this, Owen's dissertation on divine justice is not in English at all. And so Ryland does the translation and connects with a couple of other men to publish it, and really gets that work from Owen into the English-speaking world in a major way. This would have been around 1790. And so that's just an amazing accomplishment, because in that treatise, that dissertation on divine justice, that's one of Owen's biggest polemics against the Socinians, which were what we would call Unitarians. And this would have been kind of in the peak of Joseph Priestley's ministry. And so bringing John Owen into English to address the Socinian controversy was just a huge contribution, and one that I don't think this is probably the first time anybody's even hearing about John Ryland translating that work from Owen. I think I may have texted somebody about it once, but so you're welcome, everybody. Go look it up. Now, one thing I don't know if modern English versions of Dissertation on Divine Justice from Owen, I don't know if it's still Ryland's translation or if it's been retranslated since Ryland. I need to figure that out, but I think that's just a massive thing there with Owen. He has lots of just amazing things to say about John Owen. He basically says in every major controversy in the church, God raises up a person to be the hero. So he says, God raised up Augustine to fight the Pelagians. He raised up Athanasius to fight against the Arians. He raised up Martin Luther to fight against the Roman Catholics. And he says, and he raised up John Owen to fight the Socinians. And so he says stuff like that all the time. There are other things where we see Ryland's heavy dependence upon Owen. So I would say he is a true Owenian, if there ever was one.
That's really helpful. For the sake of time, I'm just going to roughly move us to the next question. You alluded to some of the writings of John Collett Ryland, and in your estimation, what are some of his most significant writings, having done a bibliography of his works?
Yeah, so that bibliography is published in the Journal of Andrew Fuller Studies. The most recent edition, I think it may be the fifth edition, or I don't know if they call them volumes, but and I think it's free and open access online, so you could find that if you wanted to. It's the full bibliography, but I'll just tell you just a few key titles. The first is 1757. He wrote a book called The Christian Preacher Delineated. It's not very long. He basically just goes down and just describes the ideal Christian preacher, what his character's like, what his habits and patterns are like, what his demeanor is in the pulpit, how is his delivery. And so he's kind of just describing this ideal Christian preacher. And this is 1757. Later, I think in 1772, he's talking about that book, and he says, you know what? I was talking about George Whitefield. And so he basically just like wrote this like just glowing description of his view of Whitefield's preaching. And he said it could easily apply to James Hervey as well, but he does single out George Whitefield. And so that's just a really fascinating read, and will be really encouraging. Anyone who's a preacher should read that book, or that little treatise. 1772, he publishes probably his most controversial little piece. It's called A Modest Plea for free communion at the Lord's table between true believers of all denominations. This is basically his presentation of the case for open communion. And so John Ryland was in the minority of that debate that kind of picked up in the 1770s. He was an open communion guy, and most of the other particular Baptists were restricted communion. A few other titles to make note of. Kind of his, I would say his magnum opus is a 3-volume set of contemplations. And the first 2 volumes are titled Contemplations on the Beauties of Creation and on All the Principal Truths and Blessings of the Glorious Gospel with the Sins and Graces of Professing Christians. That's the title of it. There's 2 big volumes. They're each about 400 pages. And then the 3rd volume is the one that I found first, Contemplations on the Divinity of Christ, that came out in 1782. So those 3 volumes together make up his Contemplations. And you're looking at about 1,200 pages or so. And it's just really, really rich. The first volume is kind of like a defense of the Bible's inspiration and natural, what reason can do and what we need revelation for. The second volume kind of gets into what all we might say. It gets into the Holy Spirit. It gets into the doctrine of God. It gets into some stuff about hermeneutics and interpreting the Bible. He's got a full kind of guide to interpreting the book of Revelation. And then, which is super interesting and very weird. It's really dependent upon John Gill. And then volume 3, I mentioned, is kind of his defense of the divinity of Christ. So I would say those are some of his main things. There are a few others that would be important to note, but he publishes a preface to a new printing of Keach's Tropologia. He publishes a sermon from Jonathan Edwards for the first time in England. He publishes a preface to the works of John Bunyan. I mentioned his thing with John Owen, so he published a ton of stuff. Like I said, he got himself in trouble publishing so much, but yeah, he was all about it.
Well, this has been a delightful conversation. Perhaps some of our listeners will be shocked to learn not only more about John Collett Ryland, who is obscure comparatively, but how much literature he contributed. So find that bibliography that our brother has created. We can even link in the show notes to that. And we would encourage you to read some of John Collett Ryland's writings. Brother, do you have any final thoughts or encouragements related to John Collett Ryland or Baptist history or anything else we've been discussing in this conversation?
Yeah, there's just a couple of last things to say. A lot of his works you can find on like Google Books, but not everything. There are some really specialized databases that have some of these things scanned in. And there's probably tons of stuff that aren't even scanned in that are in a library on a bookshelf somewhere that I'm going to have to try to find. But I would encourage you, yeah, you can find a lot of these materials online and available. You'd mentioned, why study someone like this who's so obscure. I do view this as an act of love, love for neighbor. We have neighbors that are near to us geographically, but these are neighbors who are near or far from us, relatively speaking, chronologically. And so here's an elder brother who has invested his entire life in the glory of God, and I just, as an act of love, want to understand him and know him and bring his work forward in ways that it deserves. That's my kind of role as a historical historian, is to do this kind of work with integrity and love my neighbor in a way that I'm understanding him for what he's truly saying. For Baptists, all you Baptist listeners out there, we have incredible resources within our own tradition, and you just got to find them. And that's one of my purposes as a historian, as a theologian, and as a pastor, is to help people see that Baptists have good theology, have rich history and tradition within our own circle. And you don't have to be a Presbyterian to get good Reformed theology. You don't have to leave the Baptist fold to care about rich hermeneutics and to care about even in the church fathers and the great tradition. So I would encourage you that this material is out there, and that this is our family history. There's just a lot of just great stuff that's in our own stream that we really need to learn our own theology and our own history better than we do. And if we're not doing this work, no one else is going to. And maybe just one last point. I think John Ryland is a wonderful lesson in humility, because he was a really significant influence in his own day. He published all that stuff. He had this successful boarding school. He was a really gifted and successful preacher. His son, well, really all of his family, went on to do great things. He was well known in his day. And here we are 300 years later from the year of his birth, and not a single person knows his name. It's a lesson in humility for our time. You might think a lot of yourself. You might think a lot of your impact. But at the end of the day, we are bricklayers in the temple of God. And he was faithful in his day and faithful in his generation. And we should seek to be faithful in our generation. And it takes humility to be content with that, to be a bricklayer.
Thank you for your thoughts and your work in John Collett Ryland, and taking your time today to discuss him. I do want to make known to you that I greatly appreciate the work that you're doing, specifically in recovering our Baptist history. And I hope that the Lord will also raise up others to do work like you are doing. So I appreciate you. I appreciate the time that you've taken to discuss John Collett Ryland. And thank you for coming on today, brother.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, brother.
And to our listeners, we want to wish you grace and peace and hope that this conversation has been encouraging to you. Lord bless you.